100,000 innocent civilians have been slaughtered by George Bush and Tony Blair's bombs since the start of the war. I was speaking to a Sheikh Majid al-Ghaud in Fallujah a few weeks ago, and he said that their estimates are that the figure is nearer 500,000. But the anti-war movement goes on. It's very, very active, and the backbone of the movement is supplied by the Muslim community in Britain, by the Muslim Association of Britain. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims marched alongside hundreds of thousands of people from the left, socialists, people from the right, people from all walks of life on February the 15th, 2003. And as I say, we didn't stop the war, but I'm sure that we saved lives. And what we have done is we have ensured that Britain certainly will no longer go into any military adventures with George Bush, because if Blair dare take the army, the British Army, into any other military adventures, any other illegal wars, we in Britain will not only march, we will riot and we will bring him down.
All due respect to your experience, as well as to the power of a lot of Muslim women and the kindness of a lot of Muslim men, a lot of Muslims in New Zealand, or from our experience, have arrived as refugees from the Taliban. And so I wonder how you would answer to a lot of women in this room that have suffered under the Taliban for what you've been saying about your personal experience, you were a Western journalist there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's a very good question, and I have actually met some Afghan women who did flee the Taliban. I met them in Christchurch, and they listened to my story and they thanked me for it. The reality is that the Taliban were no more brutal than the previous regime, and certainly this regime leaves a lot to be desired. For instance, the prison where I was held, I returned, I've been back to Afghanistan 4 or 5 times, and I went to it, and it is jammed with young girls aged 12 to 16 whose only crime is that they've run away from home because they don't want to be sold off as child brides, a practice that the Taliban had stamped out. And these child brides are expected to marry men twice and 3 times their age. Yes, the feared Vice and Virtue squad has gone, but in Herat it has been replaced by another equally odious group. Loosely translated, it's called the Chastity Squad, and these are pulling in young girls aged 12 to 16 again and having them internally examined to see if they are still virgins. There are no career women emerging from the rubble of Afghanistan. There are a few little green shoots of hope, but that's about it. Karzai made such a big deal when he announced that Seema Sama was to become the first Afghan women's minister. I went to Afghanistan in February 2002 to interview her. I couldn't even find her. The Karzai government hadn't even given her an office in the government building. It was all lip service, and she was eventually hounded out of that position in the summer with death threats. The only success story in Afghanistan at the moment is the production of opium, which has made Afghanistan the #1 heroin producer in the world. The city where I was held, Jalalabad, now has hardcore porn for sale in DVDs in the front windows. These I live in Soho, London's red light district, and I can tell you now, these DVDs wouldn't even be sold under the counter in Soho, but they're in the front windows in Afghanistan. What we have given the Afghan people is drugs and porn, and I'm no doubt sure they've got the rock and roll as well. One of the most respected charities, Médecins Sans Frontières, pulled out its entire operation with great reluctance last year after half a dozen of its people had been murdered near Bamyan. They knew who had carried out the murder, somebody closely related to a friend of the Afghan government, and there was a refusal to hold an investigation. And that is why Médecins Sans Frontières pulled out of Afghanistan. And it was an excellent charity as well. Hamid Karzai is laughingly called the mayor of Kabul because he's lost control of his country outside of the capital, and the Taliban are coming back. They're in control in certain provinces in Afghanistan. And I can tell you something else. When I have travelled round Afghanistan, quite a few people, including the women, have said, we wish they were back. Now, I'm not a supporter of the Taliban, but at least under the Taliban there was security. That security has gone. And the other thing that the Afghan women tell me is, will the West please drop this obsession with the burqa? Tell us how we can get our children educated. Tell us how we can put food on the table. Tell us how it can be safe for me to walk down the street without being raped. Tell me how, never mind about turning me into a career woman, how can I get my husband a job so he can work to put food on the table? When you've sorted this out, then we'll talk about the burqa. So don't for one moment think that Afghanistan is a success story. It's an absolute nightmare disaster where 20,000 American soldiers are committing war crimes on a weekly basis, and innocents are still being slaughtered in that country.
As you are a converter to Islam, how would you express the jihad to non-Muslims?
How would I explain jihad?
Jihad to non-Muslims.
My own personal jihad is my cigarettes I'm trying to quit. Jihad is a struggle. There are many levels, but that is my jihad at the moment.
My question relates to your time as a journalist and the workings of the media. This is something that baffles us as Muslim, and I'd like you to shed some light on this, working both from the inside as well as looking at it from the outside now. One of the things that I would like to understand is, what are the sentiments of journalists and what are the sentiments of the media people when they report on issues that relate to Muslims and Islam? And I'd like you to shed some light on that. And I'd just like to highlight a comment that I picked up the other day in the New Zealand Herald. There was a comment that came from some expert who was talking about how to spot a terrorist in a neighborhood or something to that effect. And the comment that was relayed or written down, it said, there are three groups of people in Europe that you can identify as terrorists coming from the Muslim community. The first one is immigrants. Second one is second-generation Muslim, and the third one are converts. I'm not sure what that leaves for the rest of the people, but I mean, you fall in one of the groups. So my question is, now how do these comments get through the editorial process, and what are the sentiments of the media and the people working in the media when they do write things like this?
It's very easy to spot a terrorist. There were 8 of them in Scotland the other week at the G8. One of them lives in the White House, another one lives in Downing Street. And the biggest terrorist, the biggest war criminal is in Israel. He's called Ariel Sharon. As a journalist, I would love just to scrap the word terrorist. It is meaningless. Nelson Mandela, one of the most revered statesmen in the world, was called a terrorist by Margaret Thatcher. If you ask an Afghan farmer what is a terrorist, he'll tell you it was the guy who flew over his land and in a B-52 bomber and dropped bombs that are still exploding, killing and maiming today. If you ask a Palestinian child what is a terrorist, she'll tell you it's the Palestinian soldier who killed her sister. If you ask a Chechnyan what is a terrorist, he will tell you it is Putin who is using the war on terror to slaughter the Chechnyans. We all have different definitions of terrorists. I would completely, as a journalist, like to ban the word. And as for journalists, these are very troubled times, and finding good journalists is very, very difficult. But there are a few, and what I would say to you all is to go onto the internet and find them and learn to trust your sources and try and seek corroboration. The media has done a great disservice to the Muslim community around the globe. Part of it is due to ignorance, and part of it is due to an Islamophobic attitude by some of the newspaper publishers. And while we're on the subject, I would just like to address the agenda program on Sunday, which featured a Muslim who said that our universities in New Zealand are in the hands of Muslim radicals that have become breeding grounds for Muslim radicals. He was talking absolute, complete nonsense, and this is one of the most disgraceful pieces of journalism I have seen since I've been here. There is no corroboration to his story. He has an axe to grind. He's a very unhappy young man, and what he said was completely untrue. I have been to Auckland University today and more or less said that. We are living in very dangerous times, and we have to be careful to be able to disseminate what is true and what is not. And we have to be very, very wary of the siren calls. And what I would say to Winston Peters is, there's a village in New Zealand looking for its idiot. You'd better go home, mister.
Thank you, Yvonne. If you look back on the history, in 20 years back, we used to see the capitalist power and the socialist power, which is headed by the Americans and the Russians. But somehow, the socialist power was empowered by the capitalists. Can we say that now what's happening now is that Islam become a replacement of the socialist power?
I think that America is the type of country that has to have some sort of enemy. And I was looking into America's history for a paper I was writing a few weeks ago. And America has been at war either internally or internationally every single year since its inception, with the exception of 1892. Now, I don't know what happened in 1892, other than that was the year my favourite soccer team, Newcastle United, was formed. But America is a warry nation, and it has to have an enemy. At first it was the indigenous population, the real Americans, the Indians. Then it started on the Mexicans. Then it went